Welcome to the diner where we serve up culture from a short order kitchen. Step up to the counter and let us serve you a slice of mental pie. Not a feast, just a snack, a deep thought to chew on from a big, meaty book. It'll go good with a cup of coffee, and then you can get back to the fray with a few beautiful new thoughts to think. It's season 2, and the Blue Plate special is still Timothy Petitsis' The Ethics of Beauty, that daunting doorstopper of popular theology that turns out to be amazingly accessible and powerfully relevant. This time we're talking about his essay on sex and gender, Only Priests Can Marry, the reconciliation of men and women in Christ. Roll up to the counter and have a couple bites of it with us. Last week, we did a recap of some of the terms we had talked about, chiasm, ecstasy, and the cruciform gender calling. And we're trying to build up to this idea that it's all interrelated. And we left you on the note, of kind of like frustration, right? What are we supposed to do with this very abstract, or seems abstract, knowledge? And how are we supposed to apply it to our life? What does it mean for our actual relationships with people of the opposite sex in day-to-day life? So we're going to start with some thoughts on that. Lisa, I know you recently were reading some stuff that got some brainwaves flowing.
Yes. So I read a book called The Empowered Wife by Laura Doyle. It was really interesting because people were saying that, well, it's not a Christian book, but she has a lot of good things to say. And so I was intrigued, and I was like, well, what is this? What is this thing that everybody seems to really love? And they're talking about it transformed their marriage and things like this. So I wanted to read it for myself, because at the same time I read reviews of it, and I was also seeing like that were not part of the forum where I was hearing about it the most. And some of the reviews were very negative, and they highlighted what sounded like some serious problems. And so I said, okay, I have to just form my own opinion because there's too much back and forth going on here. It was really interesting because this author, she hit on some really good, solid advice for marriage in general. But what she did was she also extrapolated from her own experience, and she universalized her own experience and ended up, making suggestions that were, to her, seemed like they should just be universal because they jived with her experience and with the experience of many other people. Like they were based on common experience, but it shouldn't have been applied universally as a principle. So she boils it down to 6 skills, and she talks about taking care of yourself, like setting boundaries. She talks about respect for your husband. She talks about letting go of control. She talks about being able to receive. She talks about being vulnerable, and she talks about gratitude, about being thankful, all of which are good things. But what they boil down to together is learning to relate to persons, to respect the personhood of your spouse.
There's nothing in here that's really gender specific, is what I'm hearing you say. So then what were the problems with it?
One of the problems I noticed is that she had a chapter on what she called the myth of verbal abuse. And that was really disturbing because essentially she was saying that verbal abuse just doesn't exist. It's not a thing. So for her, the only kind of abuse would be physical abuse.
That's horrifying.
Yes. So, she had all of this decent advice, and then she simultaneously was saying, you don't necessarily get to have that same kind of treatment. It was just...
Well, by denying verbal abuse, I mean, God forbid someone who's being abused should read that, because it will trap them further inside the abuse. I mean, that's...
Yeah, and essentially she said that, like, if that's happening to you, if you feel like you're being verbally abused, then it's probably your fault because you're not responding properly. You're not respecting your husband. You're not, showing him gratitude. You're not doing this, that, or the other thing. You're not following all of her steps and, doing the right things. So it's your fault.
I mean, I guess in the most generous interpretation of that, I could say that There are circumstances where both parties can be really mean to each other. But that's
Yes.
the same as verbal abuse, as psychological abuse.
Right. And that's what she was conflating. She was saying because people have a tendency to do tit for tat, one person gets angry, so the other one gets angry back, and they try to hurt each other. Because that's so common, then it must mean that no such thing as verbal abuse exists, because we all verbally abuse each other. But that's just ignorance. I mean,
well, you know what? It's like you keep saying, and I think we should unpack this a little more because I think it's a key to understanding all of this continuous, perpetual conflict between the sexes. You use the phrase universalizing your own experience. This is a vulnerable place, I think, for everybody because our injury to our sexual selves is so deep. But it's a filter that if you put onto especially everything you see on the internet, you can't unsee it. In universalizing our own experience, we take everything we know that we learned about sexual relationships from our parents, our peers, and then eventually, especially our marriages, and we kind of assume that everybody else gets what we're talking about.
mm-hmm.
And this is a profound error. This is a profound error because the truth is much closer to that. Just as every individual is a unique icon of God, when two individuals are united in marriage, that marriage itself is a unique icon. We may have some things in common, but truly the chances are that when you consider all the human beings in history and who are living on the world right now, billions of human beings, our marriages are going to be as unique as we are. We have to be very careful about what we say about men and women and wives and husbands, because while what we have to say may meet somebody somewhere, it could just as easily be completely opposite and detrimental to somebody else's experience, right?
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. And it highlights the importance of knowing our limits, like knowing how much we can say and where we need to stop. Because, I mean, we talked about this in a previous episode where for all the examples that you can give of what it means to be a woman or what it means to be a man, someone will come along and say, well, that's not true for me. Whether it's a woman or a man, you can talk about what it means to be feminine, and somebody will say, well, it means, wearing skirts and using a gentle voice. But there are many women for whom that is just not the case.
Not just women, but saints in the Orthodox Church as well.
Yes. Saint Xenia comes to mind right off the bat. She wore her husband's clothes.
They're all the Theodoras. If you just look up Saint Theodora, there's like 4 of them, and their experience is very, very widely representative of how diverse female lived experience can be.
Exactly. So we have to know, like, we can't try to impose our own experience onto somebody else's experience. Like, we can't say, because I lived this, it's also true for you.
Well, this is what we're seeing on the internet when you see these quote unquote sex and gender wars. I mean, especially in the case when people have been wounded by members of the opposite sex. The generalization about, women or men, I mean, it's so painful. I remember reading, I wish I could remember where I read it, but an Orthodox Matushka, I think, this was, years ago. She wrote something about how when you are the mother of both sons and daughters, that's a profound moment that allows you to break open your preconceived notions of what it means to be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman. Because our own maternal openness to our children, if it's healthy and it's working correctly, we see them not as a little boy or a little girl, but as the unique individual they are. We don't color our perception of our children with their sex. We just don't, because we see, especially if we have multiple sons or multiple daughters, we see how different they are. that leads me kind of to what we're going to be talking about in a forthcoming episode is Petit's idea of shame, healthy shame, the first step being an unknowing.
Yes. In order to do that, we have to be able to be in the present with the person that we're trying to relate to. We can't abstract our ideas about that person or our ideas about whatever their gender is or any of that. We need to be present with what is, not what we think should be.
Well, didn't you tell me one of the things that bothered you about this book is that it divided financial awareness?
Yes, thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, she was
talk about
saying
an absurd generalization. Please tell everybody about that.
Yeah. So she was saying that, the husband should be in charge of the finances because if the wife is, then she ends up, nagging him and babying him and not allowing him to, mature and grow in that area. But I mean, that just is so. I'm sure there are many men who are perfectly capable of doing that. And if that's the case, then that's wonderful. Go ahead, have it set up that way. But there are also many who are not capable of doing that. And there is nothing wrong with a woman taking over that role, especially if she can do it better than he can.
Right. Well, this is a case of universalizing the experience to the point of absurdity.
Yes, exactly.
Because, mathematical and financial skills and things, I mean, they're not gender specific. Anybody who has an interest and an aptitude can become very competent at them. I mean, it's absurd. And then to paint men in this way that if you don't give them their way because of, God wants them to be in charge of the wallet, then they'll be babies. Isn't that infantilizing men?
Absolutely. Yes. I was just going to say that because it's assuming something about them that may or may not be true. For one particular couple, it may be true that the dynamic that they have is that the wife infantilizes her husband and treats him as though he's not mature enough to do anything. But that's not just going to be in the area of finances. That dynamic is going to extend over their entire marriage with everything. That's not specific to that task.
Nor is it gender specific. I mean, like a man can infantilize a woman too. And even if it's not happening, there are 1,000 other issues that a marriage can have that have nothing to do with finances. So,
yes.
What?
I know. Fortunately, she didn't make it one of her actual principles, but it came pretty close. She was pretty insistent that should be a thing. So anyway, let's wrap it up here. And so next time we're going to be talking about shame, like you mentioned, and being present and relating to the person.
We're getting more and more practical with all of this.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us at the diner. If this season resonates with you, you may be interested to know that over the summer, I released the sex ed curriculum I created for my own teenagers. Sex Ed for Sane People is a high school level discourse on human sexuality that, among many things, is informed by the understanding explained here in Ethics of Beauty. It's interactive, meant to be customized by you for your students, and it's available for download on my website, lauraewolf.com.